August 1st, 1941. Bethpage, Long Island. The morning light was thin, washed pale by humidity and anticipation. The Grumman airfield smelled of oil, coffee and cigarette smoke. Engineers in rolled-up sleeves stood in silence, their eyes fixed on a shape sitting at the edge of the runway, a barrel-bodied, broad-winged prototype that looked far too heavy for the sky. In its cockpit sat Chief Engineer Robert L. Hall, a man known for precision, not faith. He adjusted his headset, tapped the engine gauges, and glanced toward the hangar where Leroy Grumman himself watched from the shadows. Someone behind the line muttered, "There goes the turkey." The nickname had already stuck. Hall pushed the throttle forward. The Wright R2600-8 Cyclone engine growled awake, coughing blue smoke before finding its rhythm. 1,700 horsepower of pure vibration that shook the earth beneath the mechanic's boots. The aircraft rolled, gathering speed with an awkward determination, the prop wash tearing at hats and paperwork. At 80 knots, the tail lifted. At 110, the wheels broke free. The heavy bird rose into the air, steady and deliberate, defying every snicker, every doubt, every engineering spreadsheet that said it shouldn't. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then someone whispered, "Well, I'll be damned. It flies." That moment had been 2 years in the making. Back in March 1939, the U.S. Navy had issued a requirement that most aircraft companies privately laughed at. They wanted a new torpedo bomber capable of 300 miles per hour, a 1,000-mile range, and enough internal space to carry either a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo or 4 500-pound bombs, and still fit on an aircraft carrier. It had to carry 3 men, include armor protection, self-sealing fuel tanks, and an electrically powered dorsal turret. It was the kind of list that looked impressive in Washington and impossible in Bethpage. But Leroy Grumman wasn't interested in what was possible. When the Navy's competition opened, Vought seemed like the obvious choice, but their factories were already drowning in Corsair production. Grumman took the gamble, and one late evening, while wrestling with the problem of folding those massive wings, Leroy grabbed 2 paper clips and a pink eraser. He stuck the clips into the eraser and twisted them. They folded perfectly flat. The stow wing was born, a mechanism that let both wings pivot and fold alongside the fuselage, saving deck space and changing naval aviation forever. By the time Hall's prototype flew that August morning, Grumman's engineers had built a machine unlike anything before. 10,000 pounds empty, nearly 16,000 loaded, armor-plated cockpit, a bomb bay big enough for a full torpedo, electrical systems replacing hydraulics for safety. Even the fuel tanks sealed themselves when hit. The airplane was, in every sense, over-engineered, and that would be its greatest strength. The celebration didn't last long. On November 28, 1941, during another test flight near Brentwood, the prototype's engine burst into flames. The fire spread fast. Hall and his co-pilot, Gordon Israel, had seconds to react. They cut the power, popped the canopy, and bailed out into the cold Long Island air. Both parachuted safely. The aircraft crashed in a wooded field, burning to ashes. The Avenger program could have ended right there, but just 9 days later, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. America was at war. The Navy needed planes, now. On January 3, 1942, less than 5 weeks after Pearl Harbor, the first production TBF-1 rolled out of the Bethpage assembly line. Workers gathered in silence as sunlight hit the fresh paint and the White Star insignia. The name had been chosen carefully. Avenger. It wasn't marketing, it was a promise. Early pilots still called it the Turkey. On the ground it waddled awkwardly, tail high, wings drooping, but in the air it became something else. Calm, powerful, stable. It could dive hard, turn flat, take damage and keep flying. Armor protected its crew. Redundant systems brought them home. Mechanics began to notice something rare. These planes came back with bullet holes, but not body bags. Then came the moment of truth. June 4, 1942, the Battle of Midway. 6 Avengers launched from Midway Island, freshly delivered from the mainland. Their mission, strike the Japanese carrier fleet. They flew low, hugging the ocean, each carrying a single Mark 13 torpedo. The sun caught their wings like flashes of tin. When they reached the fleet, 0 fighters fell on them like knives from the clouds. One by one, they went down in flames. 5 never returned. Only one made it home, Ensign Albert K. Ernest's aircraft, its fuselage shredded, hydraulics gone, turret smashed. Radioman J. Manning was dead. Gunner Harry Ferrier was bleeding but alive. The plane had taken 9 20mm hits, more than 67.7mm bullet holes, yet its fuel tanks hadn't ignited. The turret still rotated, the engine still ran. Ernest landed the crippled bomber on Midway's coral strip, sparks flying as the landing gear collapsed. It stopped in a cloud of dust and smoke, wings sagging, alive. That wrecked Avenger became a symbol overnight. The Navy officers who once doubted it no longer laughed. The aircraft that shouldn't have flown had flown through hell and come back. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't graceful, but it was tough. And in the months to come, the war would need exactly that kind of toughness. After Midway, the Avenger's reputation began to shift from curiosity to legend. The aircraft that had limped home on one engine, riddled with holes, now carried a weight of respect in every hangar that received it. The Navy realized what it had: a machine that could take punishment, strike hard, and still make it home. The men who flew it had stopped calling it the Turkey. They called it their armor. By the fall of 1942, the Pacific was a graveyard of burning ships and desperate men. The Japanese Navy still ruled the night, its 0 fighters slashing through the dark skies around Guadalcanal. The US Marines who had fought their way onto that island in August were starving, exhausted, and nearly out of ammunition. Their survival depended on whatever air cover the Navy could spare. It was here, over that cursed island, that the Avenger earned its wings in blood. On November 13, 1942, during the night battles off Savo Island, the Japanese battleship Hiei was crippled by surface gunfire. She limped through the waves the next morning, her hull torn open, her deck burning. Avengers from Henderson Field and the carrier Enterprise rose from the heat-shimmered horizon. They came in low, engines screaming, salt spray streaking their canopies. The first wave dropped 500-pound bombs, the second carried Mark 13 torpedoes. Every pilot knew the odds of returning were low, Japanese anti-aircraft fire was precise, and the sky was already filled with black bursts. But the Avengers pressed in anyway, flying straight through it. The hits were solid. The old battleship shuddered under the weight of explosions, her decks erupting in flame. By midday, Hiei was dead in the water. By evening, she rolled onto her side and slipped beneath the waves, the first Japanese battleship sunk by American aircraft in World War II. The pilots who returned to Henderson Field were too tired to cheer. They just sat on the coral runway, helmets off, hands shaking, watching the smoke on the horizon fade into dusk. 2 months earlier, on August 24th, the Avengers had already made history at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. From the decks of Saratoga and Enterprise, 28 Avengers launched in coordination with dauntless dive bombers and Wildcats. Their target was the light carrier Ryujo. The formation was tight, the torpedoes armed and steady. When they broke through the cloud layer, the Japanese ship was there, fast, evasive, and heavily guarded. The first torpedo missed wide, the second struck aft, the third hit amidships. Within minutes, Ryujo listed to port, smoke curling from her hangars. By nightfall, she was gone. In less than a year, the Avenger had turned from an untested experiment to the most feared torpedo bomber in the Pacific. But war has a strange way of evolving. As 1943 began, the aircraft's mission changed. The Pacific still burned, but across the Atlantic another war was being fought, one against an invisible enemy beneath the waves. The U-boat, Germany's silent killer, dozens of them prowled the Atlantic shipping lanes, hunting in packs, sinking merchant convoys faster than the Allies could replace them. By the spring of 1943, entire cargo fleets were vanishing into black water. The British called it the Battle of the Atlantic. But it was a slaughter. The Navy needed eyes, endurance, and a weapon that could hunt a submarine before it struck. The answer came in the form of a modified Avenger. The TBF-1C and its radar-equipped cousin, the TBF-1D, were fitted with ASB radar sets, a revolutionary system that could spot a periscope or conning tower at night. The Avengers now flew from small escort carriers known as baby flat-tops, which shadowed the convoys. The tactics were new but simple. Once radar picked up a contact, the Avenger dove through the clouds, dropping depth charges or rockets where the radar echo pulsed. If the U-boat crash-dived, the crew released sonobuoys, floating microphones that transmitted the sound of propellers back to the escort ships. Destroyers and frigates would then move in for the kill. It was slow, exhausting work. Missions lasted 8, sometimes 9 hours. Pilots flew in black skies over colder black water, alone, with nothing but the hum of the radar scope and the occasional flicker of lightning in the clouds. They rarely saw the enemy. When they did, it was a brief shadow, a grey fin, a tower, a wake of foam, and then an explosion, a flash, and the smell of salt and oil. From May 1943 to May 1945, Avengers helped sink 35 German U-boats. Across the ocean, the British Fleet Air Arm, which had received Avengers under Lend-Lease and renamed them Tarpons, claimed about 30 more. Together they changed the course of the Atlantic War. Merchant ships began to survive, convoy losses dropped, the hunters became the hunted. One record from escort carrier USS Bogue tells the story perfectly. May 21, 1943. Lieutenant Junior Grade W.F. Chamberlain and his radioman, Chief Petty Officer Johnson, were patrolling under heavy cloud when the radar picked up a contact, faint but moving fast. Chamberlain dropped through the clouds and saw the dark outline of U-569 breaking the surface. The subcrew scrambled for their deck guns, but it was too late. 2 depth charges exploded off the bow, flipping the U-boat's conning tower like a coin. Seconds later, a second Avenger joined the strike, releasing a pattern of 4 more. The ocean boiled. When the water cleared, there was nothing left but oil and debris. The statistics were cold, but the human toll wasn't. Each mission demanded patience, discipline, and nerves of iron. These weren't cinematic battles anymore. There were no cheering decks, no visible victories. Just long hours, static-filled radios, and the knowledge that one engine failure or one bad compass reading meant drifting alone over 2,000 feet of dark water. By late 1944, the Avenger had become more than a bomber. It was the Navy's universal tool, a torpedo bomber, a depth charge hunter, a radar platform, even a pathfinder for carrier strikes. Pilots called it the flying anvil, not because it was light or nimble, but because it always came back. From Midway's suicidal torpedo runs to the patient ghost-hunting patrols of the Atlantic, the Avenger had proven something few aircraft ever could. That survivability mattered more than speed, endurance more than glamour, and toughness more than beauty. In the Pacific, it had fought under fire, against flame, against odds. In the Atlantic, it fought silence itself, and won. By 1944, the Avenger had become a familiar sight on every carrier deck in the Pacific. Its squat body and wide wings no longer drew laughter, only respect. Mechanics worked beneath its belly like surgeons, checking bomb racks and turret motors as deck crews chalked torpedo loadouts across the metal skin with white grease pencils. The Avenger was no longer an experiment. It was the backbone of naval attack aviation, and the men who flew it knew they were sitting inside the most lethal ship killer the world had ever built. That year, production reached heights no one at Grumman had imagined possible. More than 10,000 Avengers rolled out of factories, though only 2,000 came from Grumman's own plant. The rest were born in Detroit, where General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division had taken over mass production. The partnership between aviation and automobile engineering turned the Avenger into an industrial miracle. Assembly line precision, interchangeable parts, and consistency so tight that an engine built in New York could fit perfectly into an airframe made in Michigan. It was war production at its purest form, fast, efficient, unstoppable. By the summer of 1944, the Pacific skies belonged to the Allies. The Japanese fleet, though still powerful, was running out of fuel, aircraft, and experienced pilots. The Avenger's role evolved from desperate torpedo runs to orchestrated destruction. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, the Avengers flew from the decks of carriers like Belleau Wood, Bunker Hill, and Hornet. Their target was the Japanese carrier Hyo. As American fighters carved apart the defending Zeros in what would later be called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the Avengers descended low over the sea, engines rumbling, torpedoes armed. They came in under flak so thick it looked like black rain. The first torpedo struck Hio near the stern, tearing open her aviation fuel lines. The second detonated forward, igniting hangar fires. Within minutes, the ship was engulfed. Survivors later reported that the heat from the burning carrier could be felt half a mile away. Hio sank slowly, her bow rising like a tombstone before she slipped beneath the waves. It was one of many carriers that would vanish under the Avenger's shadow. 3 months later came October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Leyte Gulf. In its chaos lay one of the most devastating air assaults ever recorded, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On October 24th, waves of aircraft from 9 American carriers, including hundreds of Avengers, Dauntlesses and Helldivers, found the Japanese battleship Musashi. She was a monster of steel. 73,000 tons, 18-inch guns, armor thicker than a man was tall. But power means nothing without speed or air cover. Avengers led the assault. The first torpedo hit her port side, followed by another and another. The pilots flew so low they could see sailors running across the deck below them. Dive bombers followed, striking amidships. In total, Musashi absorbed between 10 and 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs. Her decks were torn open, her engines flooded, her guns silenced. At 7:30 p.m., she rolled onto her side and disappeared beneath the sea, taking over 1,000 of her crew with her. The next day, October 25th, brought another desperate act of courage. The Battle off Samar. There, a small American task group known as Taffy 3, a few escort carriers, destroyers, and a handful of Avengers found themselves face to face with Japan's main fleet. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all bearing down with overwhelming firepower. The Avengers had no torpedoes left, only machine guns and dummy bombs. Still, they launched. The pilots made unarmed attack runs, diving through clouds of flak, drawing enemy fire away from the escort carriers. They dropped smoke, fired empty guns, and even threw tools out the cockpit windows to make it look like ordnance. Their bluff worked. Japanese Admiral Kurita, convinced he was facing a full carrier strike force, ordered retreat. Against every calculation of power and reason, a handful of outgunned aircraft, most of them Avengers, had turned back a fleet. 6 months later, on April 7, 1945, the Avengers flew one of their final great missions. It was called Operation Tengo, Japan's last stand at sea. The target was Yamato, the largest battleship ever built. She had been ordered on a suicide run toward Okinawa, carrying enough fuel for a one-way voyage. The U.S. Navy intercepted her with a storm of steel and fire. Hundreds of aircraft from Task Force 58 swarmed the ship, including dozens of Avengers carrying Mark 13 torpedoes. They attacked in coordinated patterns, diving from multiple directions to split the ship's anti-aircraft fire. Torpedo wakes streaked across the water like silver arrows. One struck Yamato amidships, another at the bow, another near the engine room. Then more. 11 torpedoes in total, maybe more. Records vary. The explosions tore through her side, flooding compartments faster than pumps could handle. Her magazines detonated in a column of fire so immense that sailors 50 miles away saw it rise into the sky. At 2:23 p.m., Yamato rolled over and exploded, taking nearly 3,000 men with her. Between 1942 and 1945, the Avenger would help sink 12 enemy carriers, 6 battleships, 19 cruisers, and 25 destroyers. By conservative estimates, it destroyed or crippled over 1 million tons of enemy shipping. Yet what made the Avenger remarkable wasn't its body count, it was its consistency. It was always there, always flying, always coming back. Every war has its heroes, fast fighters, glamorous bombers, famous aces. But the Avenger's glory was quieter. It wasn't built for beauty. It was built to endure. While other aircraft were redesigned or replaced, the Avenger simply kept going, strong, heavy, and loyal to its crews. When young pilots climbed into one for the first time, the instructors always said the same thing. She'll take care of you if you take care of her. And she did. Through fire, flak, and darkness, Through the endless blue miles of two oceans, the Avenger had done what no one thought possible in 1941. It had made the sky itself feel safe for the men who flew it. By the time the war's last torpedoes had fallen silent, the Avenger had become more than a weapon. It was a symbol of what American engineering could do when built not for elegance, but for survival. In 3 years, it had gone from an overweight prototype mocked on Long Island runways to the aircraft that had rewritten the mathematics of naval warfare. Its story didn't end with victory. It evolved with peace. When production shifted to General Motors, engineers were forced to invent methods that had never existed in aviation. To train Detroit's car workers, Grumman built something called the PK Avenger, a complete airframe assembled entirely with sheet metal screws, designed to be taken apart and reassembled like a mechanical textbook. It wasn't meant to fly, it was meant to teach precision. Every rivet, every panel line, every cable was labeled so the new workforce could build airplanes the same way they once built Chevrolets. That system of modular, tolerance-driven production would later influence post-war automotive design across America. Even as the assembly lines reached their peak, the Avenger's toughest tests were still in the sky. In September 1944, a 20-year-old pilot named George Herbert Walker Bush climbed into one for a bombing run over Chichijima. His crew, Radio Man Second Class William White and Gunner Lieutenant Junior Grade John Delaney, checked the torpedo racks and radio before takeoff. Their mission was to destroy a radio installation that directed Japanese interceptors toward the U.S. fleet. Bush's Avenger was hit by flak on the approach, the engine burning, the wings on fire. Still, he completed the bomb run before bailing out. Parachuting into the sea, he watched his aircraft crash in flames. His 2 crewmen never made it out. Hours later, the submarine USS Finback surfaced and pulled him aboard. For his actions, Bush received the Distinguished Flying Cross, and the Avenger gained another name on its long list of men who lived because their machine refused to die quickly. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world was covered with metal. Tens of thousands of aircraft waited on runways with no more missions to fly. The Avenger, though, refused to fade. Its rugged design lent itself perfectly to new experiments. Radar technicians replaced the dorsal turret with a massive AN/APS-20 radar dome, creating the TBM-3W, the first true airborne early warning aircraft. Others were converted to TBM-3S models for anti-submarine warfare, carrying magnetic anomaly detection booms and sonobuoys that could track submarines in real time. Canada built its own variant, the AS-3, and Japan, once the Avenger's bitter enemy, assembled a fleet of them under U.S. supervision during the 1950s. The Avenger's career stretched far beyond what any engineer in 1941 could have imagined. In Korea, naval pilots still trained with the same Mark 13 torpedo that had been carried over Midway. On May 1, 1951, a formation of AD-4 Sky Raiders performed the last aerial torpedo attack in history against the Hwacheon Dam using the very same weapon first carried inside an Avenger's bomb bay nearly a decade earlier. The circle was complete. By the time production ended, 9,836 Avengers had been built. They flew roughly 46,000 combat sorties and suffered 729 losses, a combat attrition rate of just over 1.5%, one of the lowest of any frontline attack aircraft of the war. More than 500 enemy merchant ships had been destroyed by their torpedoes and bombs. Numbers like those rarely made headlines, but they told the truth better than any propaganda poster ever could. Engineers who examined the wrecks that limped home called the Avenger the best-designed insurance policy in aviation. Its electrical actuation systems, heavier than hydraulic ones, rarely failed under damage. Its self-sealing tanks, armor plate, and redundant control lines gave crews extra minutes that meant the difference between dying in the ocean and landing on deck. Even its over-engineered landing gear, which looked absurdly thick on paper, saved hundreds of pilots during crash landings. The very traits that made the Navy mock it in 1941 had made it legendary by 1945. After the war, many Avengers were sold as surplus to civilian operators. Some were converted into crop sprayers, others into fire bombers that battled wildfires across California and Canada for decades. Farmers would look up and see a warplane sweeping across their fields, its big round engine echoing like distant thunder. They didn't know it, but they were listening to history still alive. By the late 1950s, the Avenger finally began to disappear from active duty. Canada and Japan retired their last units around 1960. The US Navy kept a few for training and weather reconnaissance until 1954. One by one, the hangars emptied, the engines cooled, and the silence of peace returned. But the name never vanished. Today, roughly 60 Avengers survive in museums and private collections around the world. A handful still fly, their massive wings folding gracefully like the paperclip prototype that started it all. When one of them lifts off at an air show, people look up and smile, unaware that the shape crossing the sky once carried the weight of entire oceans on its wings. The sound is unmistakable, that deep, rhythmic growl of the Cyclone engine, the same heartbeat that echoed across Midway, Guadalcanal, and Leyte. It isn't beauty that holds the crowd's gaze, it's presence, the kind that comes only from something built too strong to quit. 9,836 built, 46,000 sorties flown, 729 lost, over 500 merchant ships destroyed, more than any other naval aircraft in history. For the men who flew it, the Avenger was never just a machine. It was a promise that if they gave it everything, it would bring them home. And when its broad shadow moves across the ground today, even for a second, it feels as if a piece of that promise still lives in the air. The heavy bird that shouldn't have flown still does.